Welcome to the Wildlife Health Talks. This is the 73rd episode introducing WADA members and their amazing work all over the world. I'm your host, Kat Vendl, and today we're talking about something that most of us prefer not to think about: death and dead animals, and lots of carcasses. But my guest argues that carcasses aren't just ecological leftovers. They're actually critical interfaces where wildlife, domestic animals, and pathogens can collide in ways we have barely begun to understand. My guest, Niraj Meisuria, is a PhD student at the University of Sydney in Australia who studies scavenging, ecology, and disease transmission. While he's based in Sydney, his current fieldwork takes him to the far northeastern tip of Queensland, where he's investigating how carrion might shape disease dynamics, from wedge-tailed eagles fighting over kangaroo carcasses to brushtail possum unexpectedly turning carnivorous in winter. Niraj's research reveals a hidden world of ecological drama with serious implications for biosecurity. And I always love talking all things dead. Welcome to the show, Niraj.
Thank you so much, Kat, for having me. It's a real privilege.
Niraj, when did you join the WDA?
I'm a very new member, I guess. I only joined this year, so I started my PhD just in July and then shortly became a WDA member prior to attending the Australasian WDA conference in that Adelaide Hills.
Nice. So did your supervisor coerce you into joining? Is that how it worked?
Oh, he didn't have to try very hard. It looks like an amazing society. And the conference was really amazing. I really enjoyed it, especially like the single session talk style and the community. It was really nice.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad you liked it. I went there as well. This is how we met. And yeah, you also gave a talk about your work there. And I was very impressed. So I was like, oh, we definitely have to talk about this more. Great. So would you say, is this your favorite WDA related experience so far then, conference?
I guess it's my only one, but yeah, it was a really nice experience. I'll
Oh,
definitely be
that's
back.
good.
Yeah.
I'm glad you had a good start. Nice. Next year in New Zealand, I hope we will see each other there again.
I'll see you then. Yeah.
Sounds great. Your research field is quite, I would say, quite unique. Not many people work in this field with carrion and dead animals. I've done a bit of work in that space, so that's how I naturally felt drawn to it. But how did you get involved with all things dead, and what fascinates you about it?
Yeah, I guess it is a little bit niche, this field of carrion ecology. I first got started in it when I was looking for an honors project. So I did an undergrad in vet science, and so when I was looking for an honors project, there was all these honors projects looking at like lab-based stuff. And I'm horrifically incompetent in a lab, so I thought I can't do this. I need something different. Something in wildlife was what I was after. And I remember getting a lecture from a guy called Tom Newsom in my undergrad where he explained the ecology of dingoes and their role as scavengers and their really important role in Australian ecosystems. So I reached out to him to see if there was any honors projects he was offering. I really wanted to do dingoes, but then he offered me this project on eagles and looking into their social behaviors and scavenging behaviors around carcasses. And so then I spent that year looking through old data, tagging the behaviors of eagles, and it was really fascinating. It was awesome, even though I was stuck in a lab like I didn't want to be, but it was quite enjoyable. And what fascinates me about it is it's a really underutilized source of data, but it's also really underappreciated in ecosystems. Anywhere there's animals, they will inevitably pass away to a multitude of reasons. And the effect on the ecosystem doesn't end when they die, it only just begins. There's all these sort of carrion decomposition dynamics, there's social behaviors, there's ecotoxicology comes into it, and then obviously disease ecology, which is really quite unknown at the moment surrounding carcasses.
I totally understand that fascination. So, no more questions there and no judgment whatsoever. When most people think about disease transmission, they often imagine direct contact between live animals or people. Why should we actually care about dead animals as disease interfaces?
That's certainly a loaded question. I think, firstly, it's really important to understand that carcasses are a real hotspot of social interaction. So you mentioned when people think about disease transmission, they think about these direct contacts between live animals or people. But the fact of the matter is that carcasses bring together so many species into a one focal resource, and they're interacting for quite a long time. In some areas, carrion can last up to years in cold environments. But contrasting in warmer environments, they can be depleted very quickly. But across the board, carrion is a super valuable resource to so many species, and it really brings together not only individuals from the same species, but interspecies interactions are really common as well. Secondly, I think many pathogens can survive quite a long time in carcasses. African swine fever is a really good example of that, where it can survive in cooler seasons in carcasses for weeks and months and frozen carcasses for years. And yeah, we're only just starting to uncover the role that carcasses might play in disease transmission. But I think the most important factor to consider is that because it's such an important resource for so many species, it supports so many species, it really brings together quite a lot of individuals and it really induces quite a lot of social contact.
While you were talking about it, I had this image in my mind popping up, which is a bit like when people in the village come together at the well or at the market
Yeah,
to buy their groceries. So in a way, it's
it's
like
like any
that.
other resource. If you cast your mind back to COVID, the whole idea was to minimize contacts between people. You couldn't go to the cafes, all these like quite, I call them resources, even though they're a cafe, but they bring together people. And I guess maybe carrion in an ecosystem is just like scavengers cafes. They come, they get free feed, they don't even have to pay for it. And yeah, it's a real hotspot of social interaction.
Nice. I feel like we have a first part of the title for your next paper already, the Carcass Cafe. I love it.
Oh,
Um,
that's very good.
Yeah, you mentioned your honors research. And so you had, or in that study, if I got that correctly, about 120 kangaroo carcasses, like spread across the desert and on different in forest and alpine regions. And how did they even get so many kangaroo carcasses to start with?
That's a really common question. Firstly, that data was collected by an old PhD student. Her name's Emma Spencer. It was an absolutely colossal effort. She deployed upwards of 200 carcasses across Australia during her time as a PhD student. And it really set the basis of what we know for Australian scavenging ecology. So yeah, she did an absolutely amazing job. In terms of sourcing the carcasses, they're sourced from local management culls. So a lot of landholders in Australia have licenses to conduct damage mitigation culls. And so they commonly shoot kangaroos. It might be a bit confronting to hear, but kangaroos are quite hyper abundant in Australia in many places. So many landholders will control their numbers to limit their damage on their property. And we've also used road-killed carcasses once before. National parks will collect these carcasses for us and place them in a large freezer, and then we can deploy them experimentally. And then we also make use of government and national park culls as well. We have a lot of feral and invasive species in Australia that are controlled really commonly, and so it produces a lot of biomass, produces a lot of carcasses. And it's not only ecologically relevant to be studying carcasses, given we do so much control here in Australia, but yeah, so that's how we procure these carcasses usually.
Yeah, in your eagle research, you found that there were lots of fights and more fights between the wedge-tailed eagles in the desert and during the cooler months. Like what was driving that aggression in your study? What did you find there?
Yeah, it was really cool to see how not only scavenging rates but also social behaviors changed across contexts and seasons. And so in that study, we looked at the desert, the alpine region, and a forest region, which is more temperate, and focusing on wedge-tailed eagles are really important. They're an apex scavenger here in Australia. So to set a bit of global context, there's obligate scavengers, which we only vultures, so they eat only carrion. But here in Australia, we don't have any vultures or obligate scavengers, but we do have dingoes and eagles, and they're what we call apex scavengers. And they're called apex scavengers because they can find and consume carrion relatively quickly. And so they play a really important role in Australia in cleaning up our carcass load. And in that study, I developed this idea basically says that carrion has this sort of spatio-temporal value to facultative scavengers. The facultative are those that switch between predation and scavenging, so like opposite to vultures. And it just basically says that in the cooler seasons and in less productive environments like the desert, this resource is much more valuable to these species during that time as opposed to times of high prey availability or high productivity. And so I suspect that's what was driving not only the higher scavenging rates that we saw in wedge-tailed eagles in the desert and in cooler months across all the regions, but it was also driving the social interaction that we saw. So this was not only like aggressive interactions, it was actually really funny to see like massive eagles going at each other in the desert around this carcass. We saw that in these cooler regions and in the desert bioregion, it was not only more aggressive acts between these eagles, they're really going at each other around these kangaroo carcasses, but there were a lot more co-feeding events as well. So they was happy to share this resource to some extent, given, I think, given the environmental conditions of perhaps lower prey availability and lower productivity. And so I suspect it facilitates survival, but it's to some extent competitive effects will take over at some point, and these aggressive interactions will be induced in these conditions.
Do I understand it correctly that in your honors project, you didn't really look into disease transmission risks? It was more about behavior and who comes to the carcass and what does it do to the dynamics of the scavengers? Is that right?
Yeah, so during my honors and the sort of projects after that, I didn't look at any sort of disease risk or disease transmission risk. It was more centered around it's sort of individual scavengers like the wedge-tailed eagle. And then I was part of this really interesting project looking at brushtail possum scavenging, which was, yeah, a little unexpected to find that brushtail possums are such common scavengers like in the alpine region. But no, yeah, so I've only started looking at the disease dynamics around carrion very recently, and yeah, none of that is published yet. But hopefully in the next few years that will come out.
Yeah, very cool. I'm definitely looking forward to those papers. This is a great segue to your PhD project. So you've just come back from, I think, 10 days in the field in far northeastern Queensland. In a way, I'm a bit jealous, but on the other hand, being based in northern Queensland myself, I know how hot it gets, and a lot of people avoid being outside, especially in the middle of the day at all. And I guess you had to be out quite a bit. So please walk us through. What did you do during those 10 days in the field?
Yeah, so my PhD is based up in Cape York. Just by the way, absolutely stunning area to work in. Like I feel so lucky to be able to work there. Yeah, so my PhD is going to be investigating how carrion could be playing a role in disease transmission. And yeah, there's quite a few factors I think we need to consider with disease transmission at carcasses, but my PhD work is specifically going to be looking at the interactions between wild and domestic species at carcasses. So up in Far North Queensland in the Cape York Peninsula where I'm working, there's five communities up there and they have an abundance of community dogs. So they're just free roaming dogs. They run loose, they run through the bush and they come back. And there's a really healthy population of dingoes up there, like wild dogs up there as well. And so what we did was we put out pig carcasses, feral pig carcasses. We obtained them from a cull that was being conducted by national parks up there. So they culled the feral pigs because they heavily predate on turtle eggs along the beaches up there.
Mm.
And so we placed out these pig carcasses on a sort of
Niraj, sorry.
transept.
Sorry to briefly interrupt. I have to add here. I just recently learned that for everyone who doesn't know, right, who doesn't live in Australia, feral pigs are a massive problem in Australia for, as you just said, turtle eggs, which I also didn't know. Yeah,
Mm.
incredible. But I recently learned that they also predate on lambs. I had no idea.
Yes, did you see that video recently?
I didn't see, I read the article, I didn't see the video. So yeah,
Yes.
they are feral indeed. Yeah.
Yes, they are incredibly feral, and their ranges are massive. They range from all the way up in far north Queensland, all the way down to the Alps. And we have a paper coming out soon about feral pig scavenging in the Alps region. And so not only do they have massive impacts on ecosystems, they do these really destructive like rooting behaviors, but then they also predate on small mammals. And there was, you think you might have seen it as well, that the video of the pig chasing down a lamb and predating it. But yeah, they're also really quite prolific scavengers we're finding, which is concerning given the risk of African swine fever, and we know that they scavenge and cannibalize their own. And I think this is certainly already playing a part in the European transmission of African swine fever through the continent. But yeah, again, it's just so little is known about carrion disease transmission pathways that, yeah, we just don't really know.
Fascinating field we're getting into now. Love it. Yeah, so now you got those pig carcasses and you put them out on the land. What's the next step? What did you look at next?
Yeah, so we put them out in a sort of transect running from these communities out to a remote area. So the remote area was actually the tip of Australia. It's the sort of the furthest the northernmost point on the Australian continent. I think my furthest point was 1 kilometer from that tip of Australia, which is really cool. But yeah, so we're gonna run this study 3 times across 3 different seasons. So the one we've just done, the deployment we've just done, will be a pre-wet season, and then we're going to run it again post-wet season and then peak dry season. And so I might have mentioned before, but scavenging by facultative scavengers is mainly driven seasonally, but we know really quite little about tropical scavenging dynamics. Wet and dry conditions, like across the tropics, are quite different to summer and winter in temperate and alpine regions. And I'm predicting that in dry conditions, these dingoes and these wild dogs will move closer to town just purely because there's be more resources around town. There's the rubbish tip, just more human activity. But then during the wet season, I suspect that they will move back out into more remote areas, and perhaps that these free roaming community dogs will also follow them out. Because it's hard to say, but a lot of them aren't really looked after. Like they're free roaming. They're not really owned by any one person. They're owned by the community, and they're often like out in the bush scavenging for their own nutrition. And yeah, I'm trying to figure out mainly from a sort of rabies preparedness situation what the sort of contact rates are between not only dingoes and not only dogs, but whether these carcasses might be playing a role in facilitating interactions across that domestic wild interface, which is a really concerning if they are, given how much control does happen in Australia, how many the carcasses are everywhere. Like you can't escape them. Wherever there's life, there is carcasses. And I guess a lot of people don't see them or they're hidden away in the bush, but they're there. And it will be really interesting to see how these interactions play out over seasons and across this sort of transect.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. And you mentioned rabies, very important topic, of course. So currently, Australia is considered rabies free, although, as I learned recently, that's not uncontroversial. But anyway, different topic.
Yes.
We don't have time for that today.
Perhaps not get into that. No.
That's right. That's right. Next time. Next time. So there is a kind of looming risk, from what I understand, that there might be a spillover in the near future. And then that's when the carcasses might play an important role, right? As kind of the marketplace to spread rabies. So can you briefly talk us through, like, where would rabies come from? And how are you afraid might this pan out with the carcasses?
So, in terms of the carcass, I think the real answer is no one knows. But
That's why you're doing
yeah,
this, right?
yes, exactly. But in terms of the rabies risk, yeah, so rabies has been slowly moving through Indonesia for years now. And I believe the most recent outbreak was in West Timor a couple of years ago. And yeah, if you'd like my perhaps naive opinion on this, I think given the likely route of entry into
Niraj, you're the
Australia,
expert here, so it's definitely not a naive opinion. Please, I want to hear it.
the most likely route of entry of rabies, and it is a serious risk of rabies being introduced into Australia, is into sort of East Arnhem Land, which is in the Northern Territory and in the Cape York Peninsula where I'm currently working. And I think, yeah, I think a rabies incursion could be catastrophic. And I'll explain why I think that. So these areas are extremely remote. Where I'm working up in Cape York is over 1,000 kilometers from any major cities. So Cairns is the closest major city, and it's yeah, over 1,000 kilometers away. And I mentioned before, these areas have really healthy dingo populations, which is great. but also commonly have an abundance of free-roaming community dogs. Vaccine deployment would be very tricky, just given the remote nature of the location. And rabies has an incubation period like of weeks and up to months. So you add carcasses into this mix, which will inevitably happen with the rabies outbreak. And it may be a perfect storm for a disease like rabies, especially in Australia, because we have no vultures or obligate scavengers. Dingoes are arguably the most efficient scavenger in Australia. I would say they are the most important scavenger in Australia. They can really clean up carcasses very well. We know that they scavenge in large group sizes, which is obviously a risk. And it very likely will increase contact rates between dingoes, not only within packs, but between packs of dingoes as well. And if I can give an example of why I think it's such a massive risk, is you might have heard of the mass poisoning of the vultures in India
Mm.
after the diclofenac sort of situation. Some ridiculous percentage of the vultures in India declined and died. And following that, dogs and lots of dogs filled that ecological niche of scavenging and dealing with that carcass, and there was massive uptick in rabies incidents. And yeah, look, I think it could be catastrophic in Australia, but we really need to understand a bit more about dingo ecology in that area. We need to understand a little bit more about interactions and contact rates around these carcasses to be able to make a more informed sort of prediction or yeah, or models.
Yeah, lucky that your project is already well funded. Otherwise, if it wasn't, I think that was a very good pitch to put in some more money to support your work. Does that mean for your PhD in the near future, are you going to do some modeling work as well? Once you've done the behavioral observations, like who's around the carcass, who's meeting each other, what's happening there? Yeah, that you do modeling about the bigger picture. Is that part of the plan?
Yeah, so I think that's the end goal for this sort of project. But yeah, we need really good data to make better models of disease spread. And yeah, so the sort of problem with the current disease models, especially around predicting rabies spread in Australia, is multifaceted in that we have really poor data on, first of all, the density of canids, density of dogs and dingoes, and then the sociability of these dogs and dingoes is really difficult to put a number on. So essentially, the contact rates between dogs, contact rates between dingoes, and the contact rates between dingoes and dogs tricky to do that in such a wild and remote area. It's tricky to quantify contact rates anywhere, but yeah, so we need better data on the densities and on the contact rates between these focal species. And that's what I'm hoping that my research will uncover, and that we'll be able to go into these more advanced disease spread models so we might be able to understand what an incursion might look like.
Before we wrap up, one last question for you. We talked about the transmission risk through social interactions, like nose to nose between the dingoes. But are there any other transmission routes beyond the social interactions that you are looking at?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are quite a few other routes of transmission that potentially we should be concerned about. And I'm hoping my PhD research will uncover a few of these as well. But yeah, so I think socially transmitted diseases are really important to consider around carcasses, but a couple of others are what I'm calling carcass mediated transmission. And so this is from the carcass itself to scavengers. And so this is really important for diseases like African swine fever that I mentioned before, where pathogens are able to survive not only in the carcass, but exogenously in the soil as well, that around the carcasses. And because carcasses bring together so many species, it's such a hotspot. I think it's a really important factor to consider in terms of disease ecology around carcasses. And another one, which I'm not sure is so important, but I think it could be an important factor to consider as well, is what I'm calling scavenger mediated transmission. So this is important for pathogens that might be introduced to the carcass site by scavengers. And I think this would play a bigger role in multi-host pathogens, something like leptospirosis. And anecdotally, I'd love to quantify this, but anecdotally, we find like canids like foxes and dingoes will scent mark and urinate
Mm.
on the heads of carcasses mostly, which is really funny. And yeah, for multi-host pathogens, I think that's a really important thing to consider as well. If a dingo or a fox comes in, leaves behind something, and another scavenger attends that carcass, I think that's a risk for disease transmission. And lastly, I think perhaps the most important factor to consider whether with increasing urbanization and ever decreasing wild and natural space, whether carcasses could potentially be playing a role in facilitating contact in that wild and domestic interface. Yeah, and so that's something that my PhD is definitely trying to focus on is that important interactions that cross that wildlife domestic barrier.
Yeah, very cool. It is really fascinating, isn't it, to think of all the other, like all the potential routes of transmission. And yeah, peeing on the heads, who would have thought? Oh, very cool, Niraj. Thank you so much for sharing the story of your research with us. I'm really excited to hear what you find.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. It was really enjoyable.
We will have to follow up in, say, maybe a year or two to see where you're at and what you found. And we're looking forward to that.
To update you when I have actual data.
That's right. Thanks for listening to the Wildlife Health Talks. We will be back with a new story in 2 weeks. Bye for now.